everybody. I must say, tweeting is a bit intimidating for the insecure amongst us who give these talks and how it's going to be transmitted beyond here. So I'll be careful what I say. No, I'm kidding. I'll be perfectly kind of open with what I've got to say. I do feel a bit privileged to be the first speaker in your event this morning, but I must say I have hijacked the program a little bit in that I'm going to give a plug a little bit around what the Competition Commission as an institution does, rather than speak exclusively on how to make business more competitive in South Africa. It's not entirely unrelated, because I think the Competition Commission and competition authorities do have some role to play in this country around making businesses more competitive. And I'll try to be very quick, because I think the more interesting part of interactions like this are in the questions. So I should just start off by saying what the background to competition law and competition policy and why this is a big issue in South Africa is, how did this come about. And I think it's important to note that historically, South Africa, the way in which South African economy developed has a lot to do with the kinds of competition problems we're dealing with right now. Essentially, the economy developed through a very close relationship between what some writers have called minerals and energy complex in South Africa, where there was a very close relationship between the then government and the minerals and energy sector, and a lot of economic development occurred because of the support that government gave these sectors. So we're talking about mining essentially here, minerals, mineral extraction, energy, and if you think of all the big companies in the pre-1994 period, they were all companies that were developed through an enormous amount of state support. Think of Sasol, think of Eskom, think of ISCOR, which is now Metal Steel. That's where the big investments went. And there was very little investment in the manufacturing sector, because South Africa saw itself as a kind of net exporter of raw materials. So that's the mineral side, and providing the kind of energy resources was what government saw itself as its role as in promoting economic development. And so what we ended up with is an economy characterized by very high levels of concentration. In a number of very important markets, we have very few players, 3, 4, 5 maximum. Think of banks, for example. There's a limited number of market participants, kind of resulting in not as much competition as we could have if there were more players in there. Over and above that, in South Africa, industry associations played a very big role in liaising with government and in providing a forum for firms to collude with each other. So it was in these industry associations that the kind of culture and practice of collusion between firms was developed and became culture. I mean, we had many more industry associations. For those of you who can remember, we once used to have a banana board and a wheat board and a potato board, and there was a board for every product, where essentially kind of market participants came together and ostensibly to kind of see to their interests vis-a-vis policy and other issues, but ended up deciding prices. A lot of these were sanctioned by the government, because a lot of them were kind of secretariat support was provided by the government, and so we got stuck now. We're now seeing that these cultures that were built over time are very hard to get rid of. But one of the important things, so South Africa as a kind of economy under siege because of apartheid and because of sanctions, kind of functioned in a way where the state thought it important to kind of collude, if you like, with the big industry players, and that set up a culture which we're now trying to unravel. So why are we trying to unravel this? Because these all look like pretty good kind of socialist principles to be advancing. You know, we all get together, we decide amongst ourselves, and why should we be competing with each other? And the big answer to that question is what came at about the same time as democracy in South Africa was this phenomenon of globalization. So 1994 was a period in which no country could think that they could survive in a world economy by being insular and cut off. You had to engage. You had to be engaging in what a lot of markets increasingly became world markets. They no longer, you know, kind of markets around your own national boundaries. A lot of things you want to buy, you don't necessarily, you know, think of buying books through the internet. You don't have to go to your local shop. You can source it from some overseas country, and if our post office works, it will be here within a week. So, you know, markets have become much bigger now. But so and there was, and I see some of this isn't, other speakers will speak to, what increasingly began to happen is international policy making through organizations like the World Trade Organization, for example, required countries to liberalize their markets, and in order to participate in such world fora, and liberalization was also a policy adopted by South Africa in the post-1994 period. And so with that came a commitment to promoting competition. And I think it's important then to say, well, what is so special about competition and how we see it? Because this very concept can be a pretty kind of ideologically loaded one. In other words, there are people who would promote competition for competition's sake, because that is, you know, ideologically, that's where they come from, and that's how the world works in terms of their own ideological position. But competition policy is something, interestingly, that is, you know, that is kind of claimed by people across a whole range of different ideological persuasions. It's not something that there are people who, you know, if you think of South Africa, you know, the competition authorities get support from on one hand, trade unions who are very happy with what we're doing depending on the issue, and on the other hand, you know, kind of big organized business, and they're both happy to be supporting it for different reasons, and because they have different expectations from it, perhaps. But I think the bottom line here is that competition policy, you know, in a very kind of basic, simple sense, is important because rivalry between firms in economics is what brings prices down and what improves quality. So you can imagine firms competing with each other, you know, in order to win larger numbers of customers. What they would do is they bring their prices down to beat their competitor and improve their quality of their product in order to win customers. And of course, this is very good for consumers. It gives consumers a wider choice to choose from. But most importantly, and for me this is perhaps the most important thing about competition, is that it incentivizes innovation. That when you're competing with other firms, that's when you apply your mind to produce better products, more, you know, new, improved products, as some of the ads might say. You know, and that's because and innovation is important for progress and development in the normal course. All of this, of course, leads to economic growth, which we all recognize as an important, you know, economic policy objective. And in the South African context, what's important about what competition policy ought to be doing is it should be creating a level playing field. It should be creating more fairness in the way businesses operate with each other, and creating more opportunity for new players to enter into a market, for new players to enter into the economy. And we're not just talking about kind of producers here, but as consumers, a lot of people have been excluded from the economy. We need to, you know, it's competition, greater levels of competition that will get more people into the economy. Important in South Africa for all the reasons I've explained earlier. In other words, it's competition law and policy that will break the stranglehold that this old boys club had on the economy, and kind of once you break that, new people can enter. Just very briefly then, what it is that, what we do as the Commission is, you know, there's two big things. The third is advocacy, but we'll take them as three. The first thing we would do is merger control. So, so I should have said that earlier that, you know, the opposite of competition is having, competition means many players in an economy. The opposite of that is monopolization, where you have fewer and where you have at an extreme just one player in a market. And you can imagine that one of the things an authority would want to do is to prevent higher levels of concentration going forward. And we do that by regulating mergers. So when firms merge, we've got to see to it that that merger does not result in the levels of concentration that might affect competition in that market. So merger control is a forward-looking thing, preventing concentration in the future. The other thing we do, though, is a kind of backward-looking thing where we prosecute firms that have been involved in anti-competitive behavior in the past. So we need evidence, we need to know that they've done this. We need to collect the evidence and make a case that they have been involved in anti-competitive behavior, and then prosecute it. And by anti-competitive behavior, there's three categories of them. One is, in the language of the Act, a horizontal restrictive practice. And this has to do with relationships between firms that are competitors. Okay, so horizontal, you and all your competitors getting together, either colluding to set a price or forming a cartel to divide the markets between them, you know, where they would say, well, you take KwaZulu-Natal, I'll take Gauteng, and we wouldn't interfere in each other's markets. That's dividing markets. Or saying, you know, let's kind of have a price that we all stick to and we won't compete. And of course, those prices are set to the advantage of the businesses, and consumers lose out, because had there been competition would have brought those prices down. And that's the most common type of anti-competitive behavior. Horizontal restrictive practices therefore refer to collusion, and the word cartel. Cartels is a description of that kind of behavior. Secondly, then you have vertical restrictive practices, and these are relationships between a firm and, on the one hand, its supplier or its customer. People are supplying that firm, or people that firm is supplying. And here there could be all kinds of anti-competitive behavior where in that relationship, one of the players has an enormous amount of power in order to kind of disadvantage another player in that chain. The third kind of behavior is the abuse of a dominant position, and this is when a dominant firm, this is a firm that controls a large percentage of the market. For our purposes in the Act, over 50% makes you dominant. In other words, you control so much of the market that you have the ability to influence it in ways that you wouldn't in ways that your competitors might not have, and in ways that you wouldn't have should you not have been so powerful. The third part of our mandate as the Competition Commission is to do advocacy work, and this is where we don't enforce. This is kind of non-enforcement work. In other words, where we're not prosecuting anybody or they're not in trouble with the law, but we as an institution attempt to persuade people to adopt policy positions that are pro-competitive. And so a good example of that is what the Commission did with the banks, with the banking inquiry, where we were not a regulator of the financial sector. We didn't regulate banks. That was the Reserve Bank and the National Treasury were doing that. But we felt there were problems here. So we made a big story out of it and exposed what the anti-competitive behavior was and persuaded the custodian of policy in this policy area to change policy in order to make banks more competitive. Okay, and then very briefly, the three institutions. This is always very confusing for people in the competition arena. The orange block there should say Competition Tribunal. It doesn't. But there's three institutions. There's the Competition Commission. The nice way to think about the respective roles is the Commission is like the police and the prosecutor. So if anybody got a problem, they come to the Commission and they complain, and the police and the Commission will investigate it and see if there's a case to be made, and then prosecute it. The block where there isn't any text is, and should read Competition Tribunal, is effectively the court of first instance. That's where you go and you make your case and they decide. And if any party is unhappy with the decision of the tribunal, they may take it on appeal or review to the Competition Appeal Court, which is a specialist division of the High Court. Okay. Now, making business more competitive. Okay, well, I think, given everything I've said about where we're coming from, one of the big challenges in South Africa is to promote a competition culture amongst firms. Given that firms are very used to, historically, this kind of what we call rent-seeking behavior, where they kind of cozy themselves up to government and get kind of, all kinds of breaks from government, and now we're in a situation where firms have to compete on the merits. A lot of things undermine this competition culture, including, for example, corruption. Where corruption undermines competitive behavior. So firms, for example, winning tenders with government, not on the merits, but because of relationships they might have had with the procuring department, is something that fundamentally undermines the competitive process. But it is a cultural thing, because we also need to get individuals and firms out of that way of thinking, and within that community we need to have, we need sanction from within the community. In other words, if you have a culture where it's normal business behavior to behave in anti-competitive ways, either by collusion or through relationships with government officials that are that don't promote. If it's normal, then everybody accepts it. But if we get people within that community to stand up against this and to look down upon such behavior, that's something we haven't won yet. You will still hear business people say, well, that's normal, that's how we do business, that's how business is done. And so it's to get business people out of this instinct to kind of have the good life, and not, good life is a term that a judge used for people who don't have the instinct to compete, but rather the instinct collude with others or to kind of have untoward relationships with government departments, for example. This is very important also in the context of the globalization point that I made, because no company is going to be able to compete in a global market if they are not subjected to the culture of competition in their own markets. In other words, firms that are not used to competition in the South African market are very unlikely to go out there and conquer a world market. They don't have the culture of the discipline of competition in the way that they function in their local markets. The next point, very important point around making business competitive is to have a more articulate and aggressive consumer voice in our marketplace. I think that, you know, this is the demand side. This is if the customers of businesses are speaking up and are, you know, demanding better services, demanding higher quality products, and making a bigger fuss than I think South African consumers do about the way that they're treated by businesses, that is something I think would be very important in ensuring and promoting competition. The role of business associations I've spoken briefly about, and I think that here we need to redefine what business associations do. A lot of them are used to fulfilling the role as facilitating the cartel or facilitating collusion. There's very good reasons why business associations should exist. They should exist to protect their members around a whole range of issues or advance their interests in terms of policy-making initiatives, or setting up infrastructure for that particular business to perform better, but certainly they should not be used as a front for cartels or collusion. A very basic thing, of course, is complying with the Competition Act. We're seeing increasingly in South Africa business law firms who businesses go to normally when they're in trouble with the competition authorities are now going to them to say, look, even though we're not in trouble, we want to put together a compliance program in our firms in order to ensure that we don't get into trouble in the first place. And then, I mean, linked to that very closely is good corporate governance in firms, where there are enough kind of checks and balances in a firm's decision-making to ensure that that firm does not cross the line into anti-competitive behavior. We very, very often hear at competition authorities of senior executives when they get caught, or when their firms get caught out, claiming that, well, we didn't know, you know, some junior official did this, or there were a few rotten apples in the firm who did this, and we knew nothing about it. Well, you know, to be saying that is to admitting to really bad corporate governance. Good corporate governance won't allow a situation where a senior executive didn't know. I mean, that seems like a very weak excuse. I didn't know, and you know, and to be saying that is to kind of to really be admitting to the absence of corporate governance. And then finally, there is the role of a developmental state in making business more competitive in South Africa, or anywhere in that world for that matter, and that is to create the conditions under which competition will thrive. You know, this is about creating the infrastructure and everything, as I said, from making the post office work properly to ensure that our railways and transport system generally is able to move goods from point A to B, that our telecommunications is able to kind of make business be effective and efficient. These are all kind of policy, areas of policy that a state, developmental state, has an important role in playing to ensure that the conditions are right for more competitive businesses to thrive. Okay, well, that's it from me. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.